One of the principal differences between energy wastrels and energy misers is how they regulate their body temperatures. Energy misers tend to let their body temperatures follow the temperature of the environment, while energy wastrels are wastrels because they expend large amounts of energy in the generation of heat so that they can sustain a high and steady body temperature. So, we cannot look at the evolution of energy lifestyles without simultaneously looking at the evolution of body temperature regulation. Let's first lay out some vocabulary so that we can understand something about the diversity of what we might call temperature lifestyles amongst the animals. In particular, we need to be very clear about two sets of terms that are often conflated with one another and that can cause confused thinking about body temperature. First, we want to dispose of two entirely inaccurate terms. Animals are sometimes divided into what's popularly known as warm-blooded or cold-blooded animals. In particular, birds and mammals are designated warm-blooded creatures, while nearly everything else in the animal kingdom are considered cold-blooded creatures. Both of these terms, warm-blooded and cold-blooded, are completely erroneous, so we must expunge them completely from our thinking about temperature. What people have typically called warm-blooded are creatures that use metabolic energy to regulate a high and steady body temperature. That's really conflating two different things with one another. The first thing is the use of metabolic energy, and the second thing is the regulation of body temperature. Let's look at body temperature regulation first. We can distinguish at least two extreme categories here. One category includes ourselves and other mammals and birds, that is, animals that sustain a steady body temperature. These animals are known as homeotherms. At the other extreme are animals that do not have steady body temperatures, but instead have body temperatures that vary. These creatures are called heterotherms, although a better term for them would be poikilotherm. Poikilotherm simply means multicolored or variegated body temperature. I presented these as two categories here, but they're really not. Rather, they are two endpoints on a continuous spectrum of body temperature steadiness and regulation. As we shall see, there are a number of circumstances that fall somewhere in between these two extremes. And I emphasize, this spectrum refers to steadiness of body temperature. Homeotherms have steady body temperatures, while poikilotherms have variable body temperatures. Let's now turn to the use of metabolic energy. It's here where we impinge most closely on our dichotomy between energy wastrels and energy misers. At one extreme, we have the so-called endotherms. These are creatures that generate a considerable amount of heat internally through the oxidation of metabolic fuels. At the other extreme are ectotherms, which rely upon external and physical sources of energy for their body heat. A lizard basking in the sun, for example, takes in a considerable amount of heat, but it's from a source external to the body, and it's a physical source, that is, energy in sunlight. As was the case for our distinction between poikilotherms and homeotherms, the distinction between ectotherms and endotherms is not categorical. That is, there's a spectrum. Even ectotherms generate heat internally. The major difference is that they don't generate as much of it internally as endotherms do. Similarly, endotherms have to balance their physical heat budgets just as ectotherms do, but the only difference is that they generate considerably more of their energy budget internally. Actual animals can range anywhere along this spectrum. But again, I want to emphasize an important point. The distinction between ectotherms and endotherms says nothing about how these influence temperature. It's a distinction that relies upon the use of heat energy. This use may be put to temperature regulation, and it often is. This is why homeotherms tend also to be endotherms. However, they need not be. To explore this matter further, we're going to need a fair bit of real estate on our board. Because the subject of steadiness of body temperature is somewhat independent of the subject of the source of heat for regulating body temperature, we can plot these out independently of one another into a sort of thermal lifestyle space. Along the horizontal axis, we have the continuum between poikilothermy and homeothermy. And on the vertical axis, we have the continuum between ectothermy, that is, animals that receive a great deal of their thermal energy budget from external physical sources, to endothermy, that is, animals that generate a considerable proportion of their thermal energy budget from metabolic fuels. Plotted against one another, this covers all the possible combinations that together comprise a map of the thermal lifestyle space. Let's start with the easy case, up here in the upper right-hand corner. This area is occupied by endotherms that are also homeotherms, or, as we might state succinctly, the endothermic homeotherms. These are creatures like mammals and birds. We can elaborate on this with a little subplot, which plots variation of environmental temperature, T sub E, versus body temperature, T sub B. We put in a line of equivalency, shown here as a dotted blue line, which indicates body temperature that is equal to environmental temperature. In the case of endothermic homeotherms, however, the body temperature is relatively steady over a wide range of environmental temperatures. The precision of thermoregulation might fall off a bit at the extremes, but in general, these animals regulate body temperature within fairly narrow limits over a wide range of environmental temperatures. And they use metabolic heat energy to balance their thermal energy budgets. Let's now go down to the other easy case, down here in the lower left corner. These are animals that are both ectothermic and poikilothermic, or the ectothermic poikilotherms. These are creatures like lizards, snakes, other reptiles, insects, and virtually every other animal in the animal kingdom. We can characterize these also with a subplot of body temperature versus environmental temperature. What we see in this case, of course, is that the body temperature, shown here in orange, pretty much tracks variation of environmental temperature. As environmental temperature changes, their body temperature changes along with it, and because they're not generating much heat internally, their body temperature never rises that far above the environmental temperature. We'll have quite a bit more to say about this in a later lecture. But let's have a look at some harder cases. Up here in the upper left corner, for example, we have endothermic poikilotherms, that is, animals that generate a lot of heat internally, but nevertheless have body temperatures that vary with environmental temperature. If we plot out what the covariation of body temperature and environmental temperature should look like, the body temperature will track environmental temperature, just as occurs in the ectothermic poikilotherms, but now the body temperature sits at some value above environmental temperature. This is because these animals, being endothermic, generate a fair bit of heat internally, and this elevates their body temperatures somewhat. But if these animals are not regulating their body temperatures, you'll still get variation of body temperature with environmental temperature. The principal contribution of the internal heat here is to impose a steady temperature difference between body temperature and environmental temperature. An example of creatures such as this might be flying insects, such as flying bees or bumblebees, which generate a fair bit of heat in their flight muscles to warm them up, but otherwise do not use the excess heat generated to regulate body temperature, that is, to defend a particular body temperature against variation of environmental temperature. There's another interesting example that falls under this rubric of endothermic poikilotherms, and these are hibernators and so-called torpedators. We'll have quite a bit to say about these momentarily, but in this circumstance, these animals will bat both ways, so to speak. Over a certain range of environmental temperatures, these animals will regulate their body temperature, just as endothermic homeotherms do, but at other environmental temperatures, they will allow their body temperatures to assume the temperature of the environment. This particular diagram shows the body temperature in such circumstances as being close to environmental temperature, but it need not be. And now let's turn to the lower right-hand corner of this space, what we might call the ectothermic homeotherms. There are basically two different categories of creatures such as this. The trivial case concerns animals that live in environments in which the range of variation of environmental temperature is quite small. This can include such habitats as deep oceans, underground habitats where temperatures are damped by high thermal capacities of the soil, and environments like this. In this circumstance, an animal that is ectothermic will assume the temperature of its environment all right, but because the range of variation of environmental temperature is so small, they are effectively homeotherms. More broadly, ectothermic homeotherms are creatures that are so-called behavioral thermoregulators. Many terrestrial reptiles fall into this category. Even though they don't generate a great deal of heat internally, they tend to seek out environments that have temperatures very close to what we might call a preferred body temperature. A good example of this is a lizard that basks in the sun to warm its body up to a certain temperature, at which point it begins to forage in a cooler environment until its body temperature cools to some level, and then it returns to a hot microclimate to warm its body back up. These kinds of creatures are capable of impressive feats of thermoregulation. Many desert lizards, for example, can maintain very high body temperatures with an impressive degree of steadiness, making them essentially the thermal equivalent of endothermic homeotherms, but without the high metabolic energy costs. So, the relationship between metabolic heat production and thermoregulatory ability is quite complicated and quite diverse. We'll be delving into the whole issue of body temperature in considerably more detail a bit later. For now, though, let's turn to one of these categories, the endothermic homeotherms.